The waiting room aboard the starship Periax hummed with quiet urgency. The Interstellar Union of Cooperation's flagship medical vessel was designed for emergencies spanning hundreds of species, yet today it faced an unprecedented crisis. In Exam Suite 7, a team of alien doctors hovered around their patient, exchanging hushed, anxious murmurs. The patient, a Flindar named Orin, lay motionless on the diagnostic table. His translucent, gelatinous form quivered faintly, the only sign of life aside from the weak flickering of his embedded optical sensors. His condition had baffled the medical staff, and frustration was mounting. "He's deteriorating rapidly," said Curix, a cobalt-skinned Venlori, his voice edged with worry. He gestured at the holoscreen, where a rotating image of Orin's internal anatomy displayed irregular activity in his neural pathways. "If we don't intervene soon, his system will collapse entirely." Lilar, a squat Dranky with amphibian-like features, leaned closer to the projection. "You're assuming we know what we're looking at, Curix. Every standard diagnostic has failed. This isn't like any condition I've seen in my 40 years. 40 years, scoffed Veyron, a six-armed Nentari with an iridescent carapace. "I've been practicing medicine for 70, and I agree. This is new territory." The trio fell into a tense silence, staring at the holoscreen as if willing it to provide answers. Despite their collective expertise, they were no closer to understanding what was killing Orin. What about his environmental exposure, Curix ventured? Could he have encountered an unregistered pathogen? "We've ruled out pathogens," Lilar replied. "No viruses, no bacteria, no fungal intrusions. His immune system isn't even active. It's as if his body doesn't recognize anything as wrong." "Which is impossible," Veyron added, "even for a Flindar." As they deliberated, the patient emitted a low, warbling sound, a distress call in his species. The room fell silent again, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them. "This is beyond us," Lilar said at last, his tone heavy. "We need to escalate this to the core medical board. They might have seen something similar." Curix hesitated. "By the time we get a response, he might be gone. We need answers now." The doors to the suite slid open with a soft hiss, drawing the doctor's attention. A human man stepped inside, looking out of place amid the sterile surroundings. He was tall, with an easygoing demeanor that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. His dark hair was slightly unkempt, and he carried a small black bag slung over one shoulder. "Sorry to interrupt," the man said, raising a hand in a placating gesture. "Heard you might need an extra set of eyes." Curix blinked in confusion. "Who are you, and how did you get in here? This is a restricted area." "Name's Dr. Mike Carter," the man replied, offering a smile that went unreturned. "Just a simple GP hitching a ride on your fine ship. One of your med techs mentioned you had a tricky case, and thought I might take a look." Lilar's webbed fingers flexed in irritation. "A general practitioner? Human medicine is primitive compared to what we deal with. You wouldn't even understand Flindar anatomy, let alone this condition." Mike shrugged. "You're probably right. But sometimes an outsider's perspective helps, doesn't it? Besides, I've seen my share of puzzling cases back home. Thought it couldn't hurt to offer." Veyron's 6 eyes narrowed. "This isn't a curiosity, human. This is a life or death situation." "And I'm offering to help save a life," Mike countered, his tone steady. "Look, if you've got everything under control, I'll get out of your way. But if you're stumped, what do you have to lose?" The doctors exchanged skeptical glances. The situation was dire, and though they bristled at the idea of a human interfering, the undeniable truth was that they were out of ideas. "Fine," Curix said, though his voice was laced with reluctance. "But don't touch anything, and keep your input to yourself unless asked." "Fair enough," Mike said, stepping forward. He approached the holoscreen, studying the rotating projection of Orin's internal systems. Despite the alien anatomy on display, Mike didn't appear phased. He examined the data with practiced focus, occasionally tilting his head as if mentally connecting dots. "What's this here?" he asked, pointing to a jagged line on the screen. Lilar frowned. "That's his ion exchange rate. It's been unstable since he was admitted." "And this drop here?" "An enzymatic activity in the thoracic gland," Veyron replied. It's declining rapidly. Mike nodded thoughtfully. HFY. And these optical sensors, are they connected directly to his nervous system? They are, Kirik said, his suspicion growing. Just curious, Mike said, his tone casual. Have you ruled out neurotoxic agents? We've run every toxin screen available, Lilar said, his voice tight with frustration. Nothing came up. Mike frowned, rubbing his chin. Weird. Okay, what about his diet? Any changes recently? Flindar diets are regulated, Veyron said. There's no room for variation. Sure, Mike said, pacing slightly as he spoke. And environmental exposure. Could he have been somewhere with exotic chemicals or radiation? We've accounted for environmental factors, Kirik snapped. We've accounted for everything. Mike stopped pacing and turned to face them, his expression serious. You've accounted for everything you know to look for. But what if there's something you're missing? Something that's not in your database? The room fell silent again. None of them wanted to admit it, but the human had a point. They were limited by their own knowledge, and the thought of an unknown factor, something completely outside their experience, was a possibility they hadn't wanted to confront. What are you suggesting? Lilar asked warily. I'm not suggesting anything yet, Mike said. I need more information. Mind if I take a closer look at the patient? The doctors hesitated, but Kirik finally relented with a sharp nod. Fine. But if you make things worse. I won't, Mike interrupted, his tone confident. He approached Oren carefully, pulling a small flashlight from his bag. Let's see what we're working with. As he examined the patient, the doctors watched in tense silence. Mike's methods were unorthodox, he muttered to himself, checked details they deemed irrelevant, and even pressed a stethoscope against Oren's gelatinous body, an act that made Lilar cringe. This is absurd, Veyron muttered. He's using ancient tools. But Kirik watched closely, his initial skepticism giving way to curiosity. Mike's demeanor wasn't that of an amateur meddling where he didn't belong. He moved with purpose, as if following a hunch he couldn't yet articulate. Finally, Mike straightened, tucking his flashlight away. Okay, he said, his voice calm but serious. I don't have an answer yet, but I've got a theory. And that is, Lilar demanded. Mike glanced at the holoscreen, then back at the patient. I think this might be something new. A condition neither humans nor Flindar or anyone else has encountered before. The doctors exchanged uneasy glances. The idea of a truly novel illness was both thrilling and terrifying. I'm going to need a bit more time, Mike continued, but if I'm right, we might be able to figure this out together. Kirik's cobalt features tightened, but he gave a reluctant nod. You've got 1 hour, human. Make it count. Mike smiled faintly. That's all I need. The hum of diagnostic instruments filled the air as Mike leaned over the holoscreen again, studying the chaotic readings. The alien doctors watched him with expressions ranging from skepticism to reluctant curiosity. He'd only been given an hour to make progress, but the clock was ticking, and his process appeared maddeningly slow. Do you always work like this? Lilar asked, his webbed hands twitching in irritation. Pacing, muttering, poking at things without explaining. Pretty much, Mike replied without looking up. It's a human thing. We call it brainstorming. Looks more like aimless wandering, Veyron grumbled, but Kirik silenced her with a wave. Let him work, the Venlori said. If he has any insight, we can't afford to ignore it. Mike pointed at a series of overlapping spikes on the holoscreen. These fluctuations here, when did they start? Kirik stepped forward, reviewing the data. Roughly 12 hours after the patient was admitted. Why? Because they don't look like a symptom, Mike said, tapping the screen. They look like a response. His body's trying to compensate for something. A response to what Veyron asked, her tone sharpening. We've accounted for every external factor. The patient hasn't been exposed to anything unusual. Hasn't he? Mike countered, turning to face them. He's been aboard this ship, hasn't he? Maybe the environment here is the trigger. Lilar's throat sac puffed slightly in disbelief. The Periax is equipped with universal environmental controls. Every species is accounted for. The air, temperature, humidity, everything is regulated to accommodate Flindar biology. And that's great, Mike said. But sometimes it's not what's there, it's what isn't. Carrick's frowned. Explain. On Earth, we have this thing called scurvy, Mike began, his tone patient. It happens when humans don't get enough vitamin C, a compound our bodies can't produce on their own. We discovered it centuries ago when sailors started dying on long voyages. Turns out, the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables caused all sorts of problems: bleeding gums, fatigue, even death. Lilar scoffed. And you think this Flindar is lacking something? Maybe, Mike said. Or maybe he's exposed to something here that's interfering with what his body needs. Either way, it's worth checking. The alien doctors exchanged uncertain looks. We'd have to analyze the ship's environmental parameters, Carrick said slowly. Cross-reference them against the patient's biology. And then cross-check those findings with his baseline stats from before he boarded, Mike added. You do have baseline stats, right? Of course, Lilar snapped, his pride bristling. Every patient is scanned upon arrival. Great. Let's start there, Mike said. Pull up his admission data. Carrick's motioned to the console, and the holographic interface expanded to display Oren's initial scans. The room fell silent as the team pored over the data, comparing the baseline against the current readings. Minute discrepancies began to emerge: small deviations in chemical balances, ion concentrations, and cellular activity. There, Mike said, pointing at a highlighted section. What's this molecule? It's almost non-existent now, but his baseline shows a steady presence. That's fluoranium, Veyron said, her voice tinged with surprise. It's a trace element found in the atmosphere of Flindar homeworlds. Their bodies use it to regulate neural stability and energy conversion. And how much of that is in this ship's atmosphere, Mike asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. Fluoranium isn't a standard component of environmental control, Lilar admitted reluctantly. It's unique to Flindar ecosystems. Well, there's your problem, Mike said, clapping his hands together. He's going into systemic failure because his body's running out of fluoranium. It's like taking a fish out of water. Impossible, Veyron said, shaking her head. Fluoranium depletion wouldn't cause this level of deterioration, not this quickly. Not normally, maybe, Mike agreed. But combine it with stress from interstellar travel, dietary changes, and whatever else this guy's been through, and you've got the perfect storm. His system's crashing because it's trying to run without a critical fuel. Carrick straightened, his cobalt features darkening. If you're right, we'll need to synthesize fluoranium immediately. The medical wing has the equipment, but extraction protocols for such an element are complicated. Complicated, but doable, Mike said. And while you're working on that, I've got another idea. Lilar raised an eyebrow. What now? You've got an isolation chamber, right? Something you can use to recreate a Flindar-like atmosphere. Yes, Carrick said, but it's typically used for quarantine purposes. Perfect. Get him in there and flood it with a fluoranium analog as soon as you've got it ready. It won't be a permanent fix, but it might stabilize him long enough for us to figure out a longer-term solution. The doctors hesitated, weighing the human suggestion. Finally, Carrick nodded. We'll do it. Veyron, start synthesizing the fluoranium. Lilar, prepare the isolation chamber. I'll oversee the transfer. As the team sprang into action, Mike stepped back, letting the experts take over. He felt a surge of satisfaction. He hadn't solved the puzzle yet, but he'd bought them time, and that was half the battle. As the minutes ticked by, the isolation chamber was readied, and Oren was carefully transferred inside. The Flindar's optical sensors flickered faintly as the atmospheric adjustments began, his quivering form showing the first signs of stability. Not bad for a primitive human, Lilar muttered grudgingly as he passed Mike. Mike grinned. We've got our moments. But his confidence was tempered by the nagging sense that this wasn't over. Oren might be stable for now, but there were still questions unanswered, and something told Mike that the real challenge was just beginning. The isolation chamber was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic hiss of environmental regulators pumping a simulated Flindar atmosphere into the sealed unit. Oren's translucent form had stopped its erratic quivering, and his optical sensors were no longer dim. Yet his condition was far from resolved. The team stood outside the chamber, monitoring his vitals on a shared holoscreen. Fluoranium levels are rising, Veyron said, her 6 arms working deftly at the console. But his neural activity is still irregular. The damage may already be too severe. It's a start, Carrick said. At least he's not deteriorating further. Mike leaned against the wall, arms crossed. How long until his fluoranium levels normalize? If his body responds correctly, a few hours, Lilar said. But the cellular damage might take days to repair if it's even reversible. Mike frowned, tapping his fingers on the console. And what happens if his body doesn't respond? Then he'll stabilize temporarily before relapsing, Carrick admitted. Without proper neural regeneration, this is a stopgap at best. Mike exhaled sharply, staring at the readings. Something still wasn't adding up. The fluoranium depletion explained part of Oren's condition, but it didn't account for the speed and severity of the collapse. What's bothering you? Lilar asked, noticing Mike's pensive expression. Just a hunch, Mike said, shaking his head. The fluoranium shortage is a big piece of the puzzle, but I don't think it's the whole thing. Something else triggered this. Veyron turned toward him, her carapace catching the artificial light. You're suggesting a secondary factor. Yeah, Mike said, straightening. Something that made his body spiral out of control so fast. It's like the fluoranium was the missing fuel, but something else is jamming the engine. Carrick glanced at the holoscreen. If that's true, what are we missing? Mike rubbed the back of his neck, pacing in tight circles. Let's think this through. Oren's environment changed when he boarded this ship. His body started crashing after 12 hours. We've got a partial fix with the fluoranium analog, but if his system doesn't recover completely, that means there's still something in play. Lilar gestured toward the patient. We've already ruled out pathogens and toxins. There's no sign of infection. Maybe it's not something invasive, Mike said, snapping his fingers. What if it's a reaction? A process his body started because of the fluoranium shortage. That's possible, Carrick said slowly, but we'd need to analyze his metabolic pathways to confirm. Then let's do that, Mike said. Look for anything unusual, spikes in energy expenditure, rogue compounds, even self-destructive cellular activity. The team quickly set to work, their hands flying over their respective consoles. Minutes stretched into an hour as they sifted through layers of data, cross-referencing every anomaly against the patient's baseline. It was meticulous, exhausting work, but finally Veyron froze, her 6 arms hovering mid-motion. Found something, she said, enlarging a section of the holoscreen. This compound here, it's a neurotoxin. His body is producing it. Lilar's eyes widened. A neurotoxin? That doesn't make sense. Why would his own body poison itself? It's not unheard of, Carrick said grimly. In some species, extreme stress or environmental shifts can trigger autotoxic responses. It's a survival mechanism gone wrong. Mike leaned in, studying the molecular structure of the toxin. What's it made of? Can we neutralize it? It's a derivative of his own neural enzymes, Veyron explained. His body is breaking them down into toxic byproducts because it doesn't have the fluoranium it needs to stabilize the process. Mike nodded slowly, so his body panicked. When it couldn't find the fluoranium, it started overcompensating, and now the neurotoxin is doing more damage than the fluoranium shortage itself. Exactly, Carrick said. If we don't stop the production of this toxin, the fluoranium won't matter. His nervous system will be irreparably damaged. Mike scratched his chin, his mind racing. Okay, how do we shut this process down? Lilar frowned. The only way to stop the toxin production is to normalize his enzyme levels, but that requires more than just fluoranium. We'd need to synthesize a compound that mimics the enzyme's original state. And fast, Veyron added. His body's already destabilized. We're running out of time. Mike clapped his hands together, startling the group. Right, then let's get to it. What do you need to synthesize this compound? Carrick glanced at him, surprised. We'd need a sample of the original enzyme structure. The patient's baseline scans might have enough data to extrapolate it. Good, Mike said. What else? We'll need to use the molecular printers in the biolab, Veyron said. But the calibration for something this precise could take hours. You've got 20 minutes, Mike said, his voice firm. If we're going to save this guy, we've got to move faster. The team exchanged incredulous looks but didn't argue. They scattered to their stations, each taking a critical piece of the puzzle. Mike stayed close to the isolation chamber, monitoring Oren's vitals as the process unfolded. The minutes ticked by in a blur of activity. Veyron worked furiously to program the molecular printers, her 6 arms a blur. Kurix fine-tuned the enzyme model, using every ounce of his expertise to ensure its accuracy. Lilar prepared the delivery system, ensuring the compound could be administered directly into Oren's neural pathways. Mike paced back and forth, his nerves on edge. He knew they were cutting it close, too close, but he couldn't let doubt creep in. He had to believe they'd pull this off. Finally, Veyron let out a triumphant sound. It's ready. The compound is complete. Deliver it, Kurix ordered. Lilar carefully injected the compound into the isolation chamber's delivery system. The team watched in tense silence as the compound dispersed into the simulated Flindar atmosphere, slowly diffusing into Oren's body. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Oren's optical sensors brightened, their light steady and strong. His quivering ceased entirely, and the readings on the holoscreen began to stabilize. He's responding, Veyron said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike exhaled deeply, a grin spreading across his face. Told you we'd figure it out. The alien doctors stared at him, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and awe. You're an infuriating species, Lilar said at last. But effective. Thanks, Mike said with a wink. We try. Oren's condition had stabilized, his vitals now displaying a steady rhythm on the holoscreen. The flickering lights of his optical sensors projected a faint but discernible glow, a clear sign of recovery. The alien doctors stood around the isolation chamber, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief. Mike leaned against the nearest console, arms crossed, observing their reactions. He could see the exhaustion in their movements, the culmination of hours of intense labor. But their gazes kept flicking toward him, curiosity still mingling with their professional pride. Don't look so surprised, Mike said, breaking the silence. You all did the heavy lifting. I just nudged things along. You did more than that, Kurix said, his cobalt features uncharacteristically somber. You identified factors we completely overlooked. Without your unorthodox methods, we wouldn't have saved him. Lilar folded his webbed hands, his throat sac deflating in a gesture of grudging respect. I'll admit your approach was unconventional, but it worked. It's the human way, Mike said with a grin. Throw ideas at the wall, see what sticks. Sometimes we get lucky. Luck, Veyron said, her 6 eyes narrowing. Don't be modest, human. Your insights were precise, your theories sound. This wasn't luck. Mike shrugged. Maybe not entirely, but where I come from, we're used to solving problems with limited resources. You learn to improvise, adapt, and trust your instincts. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from the isolation chamber. Oren's optical sensors flared brighter, and his gelatinous form began to shift, his body reforming into a more cohesive structure. The patient let out a low, melodic hum, a sound of contentment and vitality. He's regaining consciousness, Kurix said, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. The team leaned in as Oren's form began to stabilize further. His optical sensors blinked slowly, focusing on the beings surrounding him. When he spoke, his voice was a harmonic vibration that resonated through the chamber's walls. Where? Am I? Oren asked, his words halting but clear. You're aboard the Periax, Kurix replied, his tone gentle. You've been ill, but you're recovering now. Oren's sensors flickered with understanding. I remember collapsing. Pain. Confusion, he turned toward Mike, his glowing sensors narrowing slightly. And you, a human. You helped save me. Not just me, Mike said, gesturing to the others. It was a team effort. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Oren emitted a soft chime, a gesture the doctors recognized as gratitude. Thank you, all of you. My kind owes you a great debt. The Flindar's recovery marked a moment of triumph, but the sense of relief in the room was tempered by lingering questions. As the team began discussing long-term care for Orin, Mike stepped back, letting them take the lead. He felt his job was done, or at least mostly done. It wasn't until several hours later, after Orin had been moved to a standard recovery unit, that the alien doctors cornered Mike in the medbay's common area. "We need to talk," Carrick said, his expression unreadable. Mike looked up from his steaming cup of coffee, a luxury he'd managed to convince the ship's cafeteria to replicate. "What's on your mind?" Uviren said bluntly, her 6 arms crossed. "And your ability to diagnose something none of us could. How?" "I told you," Mike said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Pattern recognition. Humans are good at seeing connections where others might not. It's not magic." Lilar tilted his head, his webbed fingers tapping thoughtfully. "It's more than that. You deduced Orin's condition with astonishing speed, despite lacking any formal training in alien medicine. That kind of insight can't be normal." Mike chuckled. "It's normal for us. Back on Earth, we deal with a lot of weird medical cases, stuff you wouldn't believe. When you've got billions of people crammed into one planet, all with different diets, environments, and genetics, you learn to think outside the box." Carrick nodded slowly, his gaze contemplative. "Your adaptability is remarkable. It's no wonder humans have thrived in the Union, despite your technological limitations." "Limitations?" Mike asked with a smirk. "You guys still use stethoscopes." Varen let out an irritated chitter. "Regardless, your contributions today were invaluable. If the Union's medical board knew what you accomplished, they'd demand you join their ranks." Mike held up a hand. "Hard pass. I'm just a guy who likes solving puzzles, not a big fan of bureaucracy." Lilar narrowed his eyes. "You could make a significant impact, human. Lives across the galaxy could be saved with your insights." "Yeah, maybe," Mike said, finishing his coffee. "But I'm not looking to save the galaxy, just happy to help where I can." The doctors exchanged looks, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Carrick stepped forward, extending a hand. "Then let me offer our thanks, on behalf of the Periacs and the Interstellar Union," he said. "Your contribution will not be forgotten." Mike shook his hand, his grin widening. "Happy to be of service. Just don't make a habit of it. I've got places to be." As the doctors departed, Mike leaned back in his chair, savoring the rare moment of peace. His job was done, and Orin was safe. The Periacs would return to its routine, and he'd move on to his next destination, wherever that might be. But deep down, he knew this wouldn't be the last time the galaxy called on a human for help, and when it did, he'd be ready.